Welcome to our tour through the Bible. Thank you for joining me. In each episode I am trying to give the overview of what the book is about and how it fits in with the big picture of God's great plan of salvation. And it's my prayer and hope that you will be encouraged and excited to read the book through for yourself. And in each of our studies I try and answer 3 questions. What was God's message in the words of the book which were important for the people of the day? Secondly, what is God's message in the book for us today? And thirdly, what does this book teach me about God that I will need to apply in my own life? Now in this episode we're going to look at the book of Esther. So in our tour we're trying to follow the big picture, the story of God's plan of salvation spanning many thousands of years, but at the same time pick out some of the special features and key people in each book. In God's plan of salvation, the nation of Israel is central. They were chosen by God to be the nation in which His Messiah, Jesus, would be born. History is His story. As we have seen in past episodes, in this story there are men and women of great faith and courage, but also many sad failures, setbacks and betrayals. When we look at the big picture, we must always be aware of the dark undertow of Satan and the hosts of wickedness trying to derail God's plan by corrupting individual men and women. In today's book, the book of Esther, Satan's attempt to thwart God's plan is plain to see. Now, if you haven't read this little book, you should. It is just 10 short chapters, but it has all the elements of a great novel. It's exciting and dramatic, with all sorts of twists and turns in the plot, but it is a deadly serious account about how one faithful and courageous woman prevented the first attempted holocaust of the Jewish people. Hitler was not the first to attempt the complete annihilation of the Jews. 2,400 years ago, Haman, the most powerful man in the Persian Empire under the king, tried to do the same. The unique feature of this book is that God is never mentioned. It's the only book in the Bible that never mentions God or any of His words. Yet, if you read this book carefully, you will discover the hand of God in every chapter. The events recorded in the book of Esther happened at the time when some of the Jews had been allowed to return to Israel after the exile to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Historically, you can place this book sometime before the book of Ezra, about 450 BC. At this time, the Persian Empire, which had taken over the Babylonian Empire, stretched from India to Egypt. It was the biggest and most powerful empire at the time. The king at the time of Esther was King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, just to confuse you. History records that following an unsuccessful campaign against the Greeks, Xerxes returned home and sought the comfort of his harem. This then is the setting for the story. Xerxes removed his chief wife Vashti because she refused his demand that she show off her beauty to his drunken guests at a banquet of wine. At the suggestion of his advisers, a search was made for all the most beautiful women in the empire to replace Vashti. These women were taken into the king's harem for a beauty treatment lasting a year, and then had one night with the king, and the king would choose which woman pleased him the most to become his chief wife. Now, don't try and make sense of the morality of all this. This is what went on in pagan kingdoms in those days, and the Bible makes no comment It simply records what happened. Now Esther, whose Jewish name was Hadassah, was an orphan who was adopted by her uncle Mordecai, who was a minor official in Xerxes' court. Hadassah was very beautiful and was one of those selected to go to the king's harem. Neither Mordecai nor Hadassah had any say in this. And as she was taken away, Mordecai forbids her to reveal her Jewish nationality without his permission. Mordecai, as a loving father, kept in daily contact with his adopted daughter during the whole time she was being prepared for her encounter with the king. Well, as you can guess, Hadassah, or Esther as we now call her, won the favour of the king and was made queen. Now, at the same time that this was going on, King Xerxes chose Haman the Agagite to be his chief minister. Haman was an extremely proud and evil man who insisted that everyone in the court should bow down and worship him as he walked by. Everyone did, except Mordecai, because as a faithful Jew, he would only bow to God. Haman's pride is stung by Mordecai's refusal, and finding out that he is a Jew, determines to destroy not only Mordecai but also every other Jew in the empire. Now this seems a totally outrageous reaction, but behind all this is a deep racial hatred and blood feud. Haman was descended from Agag, an Amalekite. This probably doesn't mean very much to you, but during the Exodus, the Amalekites had repeatedly attacked the sick and struggling Israelites as they travelled across the desert. Years later, God commanded King Saul to punish the Amalekites for their vicious and unprovoked attacks. Saul defeated the Amalekites, and Samuel executed their king, Agag. So Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman touched a very deep historical enmity. It was this old racial wound that Satan played on. Remember, if Satan could destroy the Jewish people, the linchpin of God's plan of salvation would be broken. Haman consults the oracles and sets a day on which all Jews are to be destroyed and their property confiscated. When this announcement is made throughout the empire, there is great alarm and confusion. When Mordecai hears what Haman has planned, he sends a message to Queen Esther telling her to plead with the king to save her people. The problem was that only those whom the king had called were allowed to come into his presence. The punishment for anyone who broke this rule was death, unless the king chose to have mercy. Esther replies to Mordecai that she hadn't been called to the king for more than 30 days. Mordecai replies with these famous words, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai knew that God had a covenant with Israel. Israel was his chosen people and would not abandon them. This was the foundation of his confidence. But he also pointed out to Esther that this threat was probably the reason why she, and not another, was chosen to be queen. She was the only one in a position that God could use to save his people. Now this is not stated, but it's clearly implied. And Esther replies with great courage, commanding Mordecai to tell the Jews to fast, and after 3 days of fasting she would go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. In the first half of the book, there are what appear to be a series of unconnected events. But as the climax of the story approaches, we suddenly see how God in fact was placing people and arranging events to bring about a miraculous deliverance of his people. It was not chance that brought Esther into her position, but the hand of God working even through the moral corruption of a cruel pagan empire. But she had to put her life on the line in order to grasp the opportunity God had given her, and so bring about a stunning turn of events. Now, I'm not going to tell you how Esther managed not only to save her people, but also bring about the downfall of Haman. You've got to read the book yourself. What you will see is how, behind the scenes, God set up a sequence of events so that Haman, through his own overbearing pride, put himself at the edge of disaster, requiring only a word from Esther to cause him to fall. We can learn so much from this book about how God works behind the events of the world. Today, we are faced with a bewildering set of world events that have disrupted and threatened the lives of so many people. Is this just chance? Or is this the hand of God setting the stage for the next decisive step in his plan? We will know for certain only with hindsight. For now, we must be faithful and, like Esther, be very courageous and keep our eyes on God. Until next time, we'll see you.